want to share it if you think it would be of value to any of your colleagues. Most definitely pass it along, and I'll be sending out a link and a copy of the webinar deck at the end of the meeting. So today we're going to be discussing going beyond SMART goals for strategic decision making. And just to give you a little bit of background for those of you who may not be that familiar with EZSigma, we've been around since 2000. We are very passionate about continuous improvement, and you can see our vision and mission on the screen right now. We started actually as a tech company and moved into consulting and training, which we've been focusing on for the last 18 years. And I've been involved with EZSigma for approximately 16 years now. So we offer training, software, consulting. So if any of this is of interest, definitely feel free to reach out to us. But as far as who I am, as I mentioned, I've been with EZSigma for quite some time now. And I do a lot of work on the operations, strategic planning, marketing side of things. And I also do a lot of board work. So in today's webinar, I'm going to be discussing a case study. And this was from a couple years ago when I was the board chair for a nonprofit organization. And at the time, we were going through an executive director recruitment process. So again, that's what I'm going to be referencing today, and you will receive a copy of the presentation deck. So the main objective is just to talk how we went a little bit deeper than just the SMART goal setting. We went into criteria, we had scoring, we did some logical argumentation. And so for just to help set the framework for today's webinar, I wanted to post these definitions because when I'm using these different terms, this is what I'm referring to. So I'll give you a moment just to take a look at the screen here. And again, you may have experienced definitions that are a slight variation on these ones. These are pretty standard for what I'm going to be talking about today. But again, if you're joining us because you're going through some kind of decision-making process on your own, definitely feel free to tweak these so that you can be imagining this in your own circumstance. So as far as SMART goals, I'm sure a lot of the people on the call today are probably quite familiar with SMART goals and what it's referring to. And that's just setting goals which are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. So again, these are pretty standard. It's something that we discuss in all of our Lean Six Sigma courses as well. And it really is a great base framework to go from. However, as I mentioned in our case, because we were looking at something with much greater implications if we got it wrong, we felt that simply using this framework wasn't quite robust enough, which is why we went a little bit deeper into setting up our criteria and scoring. So the purpose behind why we did this was to have that framework, the guardrails for making those strategic decision making. A big issue that I had at the time that I wanted to make sure that we were being aware of and being conscious of was any kind of bias throughout the process. Because at the time, the organization had gone through a few different EDs, and there were some struggles over the past 5 years before I had joined as the board chair. And so going into this process, I really wanted to make it fresh. I wanted to make it as transparent and as unbiased as possible. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then we also, looking back on previous recruitment processes for the ED role, there was a record of the interview questions, but there was no record within the organization about how the decision was actually made. So we also wanted to create a process and some institutional knowledge for the organization so that down the road, when the next executive director had to be hired, there was something that that future committee could go back upon and they could improve, and they could use it as their base framework to help with the decisions. So again, setting this up, having some criteria, having some scoring, it gave us some consistency and also helped to manage the conversation. So when we were doing the interviews and we were doing the deliberations, we knew exactly what we needed to talk about, and we weren't bringing in a bunch of new topics during all these conversations to confuse what we were trying to do or to draw us off track. It also helped to increase, as I mentioned, transparency, and in case we were ever challenged down the road. So logical argumentation, again, it's just to ensure that you've got an idea, goal, objective, which is consistent, coherent, and can stand up to scrutiny. This was the framework we used primarily when we were doing the deliberations, and then we did finally get to the point at the very end of the process of actually naming our preferred candidate. And I asked all of the committee members to bring their arguments and their reasoning with why they were selecting whomever they were selecting. So if this is something that you want to dive even deeper into on the argumentation side, I've put a picture up here of this book, Making Great Strategy. I recently went through it, and it really is a great tool to help you specifically with the argumentation and reasoning if you want to do a bit more research on that. So without further ado, I'll just jump right into our case study. So this was our process that we set up at the very beginning, from the point of when we were creating the job posting through to when we actually selected our final candidate and made the offer. So you can see we started at the beginning with our best case scenario. What was it that we need in the organization? What did we need in the industry? So we also did a bit of an environmental scan, which I'm not mentioning in this specifically, but we took a look at what was going on around us and where the organization was going to go in the next few years. So we also took into consideration our strategic plan and what were some of the qualities or what were some of the things that we need in an ED in the way that they were thinking to help us achieve that and to help the organization move forward. So that was a big part of our discussions for when we were talking about criteria. And then again, the scoring was figuring out with the committee what is most important. From there, we shortlisted, we went through the interviews, we did our summarizing, our deliberations, and finally came to the selection process and discussion and the final offer. So beginning with the recruitment and coming up with the application and the job posting, this is where we used the SMART goal system. And we went through, now we didn't do it formally thinking, okay, well, this is for specific, this is measurable, but this was the basic framework of how we came up with the application process, or sorry, with the actual job posting. And so you can see here we had some definitely specific ideas in mind of what we needed based on the information we had gathered and from the environmental scan. And then we also had a specific timeline mapped out as to when we wanted to do everything. And that was very important because it really helped the committee to focus. It helped all of us to stay on track. And especially when it came to scheduling, and not only for the interviews, but simply scheduling for our meetings, it really did help quite a bit. And so the committee members at the very beginning, as we were talking about the time frame, I asked everyone to really commit to doing this because it was going to take extra effort, extra work, extra time. And especially as a board member for a nonprofit, it's a volunteer position that we were holding. So when we got to the point of talking about the actual criteria for our ideal candidate, we began just with a brainstorming session. This brainstorming session came up with 11 different criteria. We found that that was far too many to have. So we decided that we wanted to limit it down to 4. So the board voted on their top 4 pieces of criteria that was most important for this new ED. And then from there, we went through and decided, well, which of these 4 is the most important? So we did kind of a 2-step voting process with that. And this was also, you can see a note here on the screen that we also began discussing KPIs at this point, really early in the process, because we thought we already knew what we're looking for. We already have the job posting. We know these different elements. We know where we want to go in the future with our strategic plan. So we really should start to have an idea of what we're going to be looking to help manage and help lead this new ED in their first year in the role. So this is what we came up with scoring. These were the first 4 criteria, and how we selected everybody's vote for what was going to be the most important. So we put down the most important would be vote number 1, least important would be number 4. So as you can see, all committee members voted that demonstrating hands-on leadership when necessary was the most important element or quality for this new ED, which is why it had the highest score. And then we have the other 3 criteria and what the committee voted on for their scoring. So this helped us as we move through the process and going through the different interviews. So from there, once we had our criteria, we had our initial scoring for those 4 elements. We took it a bit further and we drilled down a little bit more and just developed our different percentages. Again, this is all happening before the first interview so that we would know exactly how to start working out the different numbers as we're going through the process. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't a purely number process. We definitely used a lot of numbers throughout this to help us, but again, this was to help guide us, help to make sure that we were keeping the process as unbiased as possible and we weren't just simply selecting people based on our feelings. So once we went through and sorted out the criteria, the scoring, figured out our percentages, how we would vote and how we would qualify these different elements that we were looking for, we had received a bunch of applications by this point. And so we ended up with a total of 37 different applications for the ED role. And we created a selection matrix. And this was to help us to figure out who we wanted to invite to the first interview. So the process that we followed for drilling down on this first level was we had all of the committee members decided that they wanted to review all of the applications. Now, again, that's not always feasible in this instance because of some of the history of the organization. All the committee members were really committed to doing this and to really stepping up and putting in a lot of extra hours, which was amazing for them to do. So all the members reviewed all the applications, and then we left it quite open. And we said, okay, come back to the table and let us know, based on all of these different criteria, based on the job description, based on everything and our everything that we've selected and what's important, what are your top candidates? And we didn't cap the number. So what we found is that most of the committee members came back with a list of 10 to 12 people. So we then took that list and we figured out, all right, how is there any crossover between committee members? And it ended up that there were 8 candidates in total that most of the committee members had brought back as good people to invite in for the first interview. So we also at this point started with some argumentation because I believe there was 2 extra candidates that only 1 committee member had voted for, and they felt very strongly that they should come in for a first interview. So we ended up with 8 people that we invited, and 5 accepted for the first interview. So this is just our initial selection matrix. It gives you a bit of an idea. We divided it up into different categories. Obviously, this isn't everything. We ended up with a list of about 30 application criteria taken from the job description and application. And then we had all of our applicants across the top line. And as I said, we took a look and to see who met which qualifications simply by their resume and their cover letter. And then we reduced that, brought it down. 10 to 12 people were brought to the table by each committee member. We reduced it to 8, and 5 accepted to come back for the interview, the first interview. So in the first interview, as I mentioned, we had some interview questions on file from the previous few processes that had gone through for a new ED. So we took a look at that, took a look at those questions, reviewed them, and then we looked at what our criteria was, because we wanted to make sure that that criteria was part of the entire process and that we were continuing that through those 4 criteria themes. So we divided up our interview questions into 4 different sections. There was approximately 3 to 4 questions per section to determine whether this candidate really did have these specific qualities, how much nonprofit experience they had, whether they were really a hands-on leader, if they had any experience with anti-oppression. And so each interview, we needed a minimum of 50% of the committee members, and we had also hired an outside HR person to come in and sit on these interviews. Again, it was just to help us with bias because we were all so close and so passionate with the organization. Each panelist then scored for each of the questions, and the top 3 candidates were invited to a second interview. So this is a snapshot of our summary sheet from the first interview. You can see we've got all of our different panelists and our candidates. We did have a couple candidates withdraw their application for various reasons. And then you'll note that what we did is we did at the bottom of the screen here, we had the candidate total, and then we made sure that we did the candidate average score, simply because we knew that there was a different number of panelists for the different candidates. So we wanted to make sure that we were doing that to make it as equitable as possible. And you can see that 4 of the candidates ended up with very close scores. So that also proved a bit of a challenge. It was great because we had some really good candidates for the role, but it also made our job a little bit more challenging to really decipher who would be the best fit, and not only for the organization, but for the candidates themselves, if we were a good fit for them. So from there, we moved into the second interview. As I mentioned, because those scores were so close for the 4 candidates, we went back and we took some time as a committee to review our questions, to review what we were looking for, to see where we could drill down a little bit more, so that we could start to really differentiate one candidate from the next and see if there was someone that really started to show that they met what we were looking for. So for the second interview, we decided on 3 different elements. We asked all of the candidates, we selected a topic, and we asked them to prepare a presentation for us, which needed to be submitted by a specific date and time, because we wanted to know as a committee how these candidates were with deadlines, if they were the type that would submit right on the deadline, if they were early, how they would approach this. We then had them come in for their interview. and did their presentation. It was a 20-minute presentation to the panel. We then had them stay in the room for some immediate questions following that. And then we gave them a scenario, asked them to go into a separate room, on the table was this printed scenario, and we wanted them to write how they would handle it, how they would deal with it. And it was limited to half an hour. They had to come up with a solution, and that was the end of the second interview process. Those three elements. So from there, you can see here how we scored all of the different candidates. And the numbers that are in parentheses across the top, that just represents the total number of points that we gave to each section. So you can see here what the scores ended up being at the end of it. So we started to get a better idea, and this is where we really started to see that, for instance, candidate 4 was really pulling ahead of the other candidates. And again, at this point, we were still very much looking at the numbers, and we were trying to keep it as analytical as possible and to keep from naming any favorite candidates or anything, because we wanted to remove that or mitigate any confirmation bias, any groupthink, anything like that. So once all the interviews were done, what we did first is we totaled all the scores. We identified if there were any specific outliers, and we had a discussion around those because perhaps there still was a bit of bias that came into play here. We looked at additional factors that could have had an impact on committee scoring, and that could have been anything from what happened to the committee members during the day at their work, or something along those lines that may have had an impact on how we were scoring, or if someone may have gotten into a fight with a friend or family member or something. It could have put us into a weird mindset. So everything was on the table, and we tried to keep the process as transparent as possible between the committee members so that we could make sure that we really were making a wise choice. We then voted on how well the different candidates met the criteria. And for this, we did a pros and cons as well. So we also made sure to discuss that, sure, candidate number 4 met all of these criteria. However, they didn't quite meet this expectation, or we could see that this would be an area of improvement or potentially an area of risk. So we wanted to make sure that we were always balancing positive and negative aspects. So this is just a summary of our final candidate scores that we came up with, looking at all of the different elements that had been taken into account up until this point in the process. And you can see very clearly that candidate 4 had pulled quite far ahead of the other 2 candidates. So, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, one of the greatest challenges that I found leading the committee through this process was to keep the committee members from naming a preferred candidate, because there was a temptation to even begin doing that all the way at the beginning when we were shortlisting. There was already some ideas and some candidates that had reapplied for the role that applied several years beforehand that some of the committee members were aware of, and there were other applicants that some of the committee members knew from other boards that they had served on. So it was very easy to allow the group to start discussing these things, which would have been inappropriate and would have set the wrong tone for us to get through this process and to try and keep it as clean and clear as possible. One of the other things that I was really trying to prevent was also the bandwagon effect, especially when there was one committee member that was more familiar with the candidate outside of this environment than other committee members. So as I mentioned, we also made sure that when we did get to the point where we would start actually talking about the candidate, that each committee member both spoke about the positive and the negative. And then we also ensured that it was as balanced as possible. So even in the discussion period, if there was one committee member that was making a lot of positive comments and was hesitant to make any negative comments, we would move the discussion to another committee member to try and balance it out. So again, we worked really, really hard to make sure that we were being as equitable as possible throughout this entire process. Wasn't easy, but I think it was worth it. So one of the final steps then that we got to was when I actually allowed the committee members to name their preferred candidate. So we looked at the scoring, the total scores, and then we also did the naming. And so you can see that even though the scores clearly pointed to one candidate as being the best possible person for the ED role, they still weren't the number one person selected by all of the committee. So what that did is it ended up bringing up further discussions and further deliberations about, well, what are some of these additional factors that we need to take into account? And so this is where we really started with the argumentation, with the reasoning, because we asked each committee member to bring their argument to the table and to explain what is the logic behind what you're saying. So what is it that was the deal breaker for this candidate, or how does this fit in with the long-term vision? Where do you agree or disagree with this? So we did end up having, I believe our initially scheduled time for deliberations ended up doubling, simply because of all these extra factors that came out, and when it was revealed that the committee didn't all agree that the person that scored the highest was the best candidate. And that's something that definitely requires some grace on the side of whomever may be leading the decision-making process, is to allow the space and the time for these kind of deliberations and for these extra concerns that may have come up. Because some of these things, for instance, weren't even top of mind when we were having that initial brainstorming session as to what's important for the organization. So you never know what may come up throughout the process and what some of the candidates might say. So as I mentioned, the final decision, the scoring revealed a specific winner, but there was not consensus. So as I said, we had a lot of discussion time. We ended up doubling the length of time we had scheduled for deliberations. But ultimately, what did end up happening is, even after all of those discussions, we did end up hiring the candidate that produced the highest scores. And even though not all of the committee agreed, all of the committee did agree to commit to the decision. So we allowed that it didn't have to be a consensus vote, which was fine, but the whole committee, because they were committed to the organization as a whole and committed to the board as a whole, said, yes, we will work together and we will still support this decision and we will support this new ED candidate. So the entire process, some of the lessons I just wanted to share that we learned and I learned specifically going through all this is setting up a process at the very beginning is critical. Whether it's something like this, hiring someone for a new role, manager, ED, CEO, or if it's just for going through strategic planning or projects, whatever it is, figuring out with your team what is your process to get through this is definitely very important. For us, setting up the criteria scoring definitely helped us focus our discussions and helped us focus with the interviews and where we were going to go. Establishing the ground rules to help with risk, again, was a critical factor, because if we had not decided together as a committee that we were not going to name anybody until the very, very end, one of the final discussions, then it would have set a completely different tone throughout the process and could have really changed the outcome of what happened. Something else that I learned was also very important throughout this process is EI. Having that emotional intelligence to be aware of what's going on with not only my committee and my colleagues there on the board to see where their head is, but also to get to know the candidates themselves and to understand that, you know, we were interviewing the candidates, but they were also interviewing us to see if we would be a good fit for them and for their personal goals and their career goals. So really developing that, and it really helped to manage the conversation, because there were certainly times when the conversations became quite passionate and heated. And so without having an awareness there and to understand myself and to know when I was starting to get frustrated and to try and regulate that, it could have really changed the course and the tone of how we were making these decisions. And that ties directly into it. The last lesson is understanding how to navigate and manage difficult conversations. Really is a great skill to develop, and it's one of those skills that I don't think we ever stop developing. I think it's one of those things that, because circumstances are always changing, and like the framework, the living in a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, constantly changing, ambiguous world. So we always need to be constantly developing these skills and understanding what's going on. So I've listed here some references for just different elements that I've spoken of today. As I mentioned, I will be sending out a copy of this deck to everyone that signed up for this webinar. So again, if you want to dig in a little bit deeper, you're more than welcome to reach out directly, or here's some great articles that I found. There's that book I mentioned earlier at the beginning of today's session. And so I'm just leave it up for the last few minutes we've got together. If you have any questions, feel free to speak up or put them in the chat box. But otherwise, again, this is presenting on behalf of EZSigma. We do focus primarily on continuous improvement through Lean Six Sigma training consulting. So we have this free webinar series that goes on monthly. So you'll most likely receive a notification next month for the topic. And if there's any specific topic that you would like to hear us speak on, please let us know. We're always open to recommendations. Or if there's any kind of training that you're interested in, feel free to check out our website. It's just EZSigmagroup.com. And again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And today's webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel. So with that, if you need to leave, feel free to sign off. Otherwise, I will remain on the line for a few minutes if anyone has any questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you for a very great presentation. I appreciate it. And my question is that, thank you. And my question is that in this whole process of a SMART goals you mentioned, how you relate this one with Lean Six Sigma, like define, measure, analyze, improve, and control phase. So in Six Sigma, are you using the SMART goal process, where the Six Sigma methodology come in the example you given in the ED recruitment process?
In this one, I'd say it was much more loosely tied. But if you look at the DMAIC framework, the define, I would say, was when we were really deciding on what we wanted for an ED, how we were going to do the process, what were some of the specific elements, some of the criteria. The measurement phase would have been when we were actually going through the numbers and doing our calculations, looking at the scoring. And that also transitioned into the analyze phase to determine, well, where do these candidates line out? Is there someone that's really showing up as the best candidate? Should we go with them, or should we start doing some of these other discussions about maybe some additional criteria that came up or additional factors that came up? The improve and control, I'd say we didn't end up doing much in this specific example. However, my intention was that for the future and for any future recruitment committees, I'm no longer on the board at this point, but that they would be able to go back, take a look at what we did, see some areas that we could have done a little bit better, more efficiently, and that they could then improve upon that and put some new controls in place to help with the next recruitment process. Does that help?
You. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. So if there isn't any further questions, I'll leave it open for one more minute. And then again, thank you everyone for joining today. And I apologize once again, my sound wasn't working as it usually does for these webinars. So thank you for staying on, and I hope everyone has a lovely day, a lovely afternoon.